Hi, I'm Dr. Feelright, giving you common sense solutions to everyday problems. And if you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button. In this edition, we will be examining how the story of Mary Mallon, otherwise known, infamously I might add, as Typhoid Mary, could shed some insight on how we might defeat COVID-19. Let's get started. Mary Mallon was an Irish immigrant to the United States back in the late 1900s, and from 1900 to 1907, Mallon worked as a cook in New York for 8 families, 7 of which contracted typhoid fever. It culminated when, in late 1906, Mallon was hired by a family that lived in Park Avenue, and the family's only daughter got sick with typhoid and died. This case helped to identify Mallon as the carrier, as her employer hired and subsequently found out through examination with an inspector that she clearly was a carrier and she was patient zero, so to speak. But the irony of that statement is that Mallon herself was never sick with the disease and she was completely asymptomatic. Does that sound familiar to something that you've heard recently? She was a healthy carrier, and that's something that they didn't know anything about back in that time, but we are familiar now with the advent of COVID-19, where there are several people that have been termed asymptomatic and they haven't shown any symptoms whatsoever, and they've been normal, but they have been carriers and or spreaders of the disease. Now, she was arrested and she was detained, and upon examination it was found that her stool contained massive amounts of typhoid. And here's the salient point. Under questioning, Mallon admitted this: she almost never washed her hands. Again, well, you get the gist. Well, by 1907, Mallon had been quarantined in North Bend Island, and because of the media attention behind her, she received the nickname of Typhoid Mary that has stood the test of time, infamously, I might add again, even though she was a carrier with no evidence of sickness or anything. Now, it's important to point right here that denial is a common theme when it comes to a person being infected with a disease, as is what is happening today, where people kind of ignore it, or they think that it's not a problem because they're not showing major symptoms, and they go about their business just like how Mallon did, and they subsequently refused to admit it, and they spread a very dangerous disease, and they neglected to protect others. Now, eventually, Mallon was released on the promise that she would never cook for anybody again. Yet, after a few years, she started back cooking secretly under the guise of pseudonyms, and immediately there were outbreaks whenever she worked. However, when she worked as a laundry person, in the 2 years or the 3 years prior to that, there were no outbreaks whatsoever. So she wasn't transmitting the disease via washing clothes and ironing and all of that. But whenever she touched things like touched food, and that's a similar thing that I talk about in the Gloves Up protocol, that a lot of times people will bring coronavirus into their homes and they will touch items around the home, and they'll touch food items, and they'll inadvertently touch something and put it into their mouth, and then they have the coronavirus, or they spread it around to people in their family in that same manner. Well, she was later apprehended again, and she was re-quarantined in the same place for this time 23 years. Now, officially there were 53 deaths that were attributed to Mallon, but perhaps there were hundreds to thousands of direct and indirect infections because of that, because of the fallout of her touching food and transmitting the disease to 53 people, and them subsequently doing the same thing as how COVID-19 has been moving. Now, you could equate Mallon in the COVID-19 terms as what I'm going to call a virulent incubator. And what that is a person who, like Mallon, who has the disease and asymptomatic, but they keep on perpetuating the disease by their manufacturing their COVID particles, and they're spreading the particles by touching things, and it's causing a precipitous spread, as though how Mallon did the same thing by touching the food that she cooked for people with unwashed hands, and the way she went about her life. So that is equivalent to what's happening today, where people are doing the same thing, where they're going about their lives and they may be infected and they're touching items and they're touching food, or they may be working in a food service industry or what have you. And even though they're washing their hands, most of the times it could be sometimes that, like Mallon, that they didn't wash their hands and they touched food. Mallon was distributing typhoid in a manner that I'm convinced that COVID is transmitted, by hands touching things and people not wearing gloves, not by breathing. She didn't breathe on things and transmit typhoid fever. That's why I am touting the gloves protocol, and I think it's vital to stop the spread of COVID-19, because, as I said before, this is not a disease that's being spread by people breathing on you or people coughing in your vicinity, although it could be that way. That could be a mode of transmission, but that's not the primary mode of transmission. The primary mode of transmission is people touching items and touching items around their house and touching food items and then touching their face and other parts of their mucous membranes, like their mouth or their nose or their eyes, and that's how this is spreading, and it's spreading like wildfire. So we have to think seriously about people that are virulent incubators, like how Mary Mallon was, and think about what would be a way to counter that. And the way to counter that is to follow the gloves up protocol, where you are protecting your hands and subsequently you are blocking the transmission of you touching mucous membranes, like I said before, like your eyes or your nose or your mouth, and causing a kind of a chain reaction of you spreading that by, or you contacting virulent items and then you spreading the disease in that manner by touching things, or by touching your own body and touching food and other different items of that nature. So, to sum it up, we need to protect ourselves against virulent incubators, and the best way to do that is to implement the gloves up protocol to protect ourselves. And again, we should be socially distancing, wearing masks, but above all, we should think seriously about wearing gloves. Gloves on, the virus will be gone. I'm Dr. Feelright. Thank you for listening.